talking about the use of autobiographical information in reviewing. Should we do it? Have we done it? And what are the best and worst examples of it? Tim, do you have a particularly strong feeling either way in this area?
I don't really have sort of a pro or anti stance on this kind of thing. It's more that I think that there are certain ways to go about it and certain ways not to. And a big example for me is Nick Hornby, who is probably the most well-known of the autobiographical music writers, to the point where he also spends a lot of time writing about directionless men in their 30s and 40s. And I think that he's actually very good at writing about men with no life direction in their 30s and 40s. I just think that his actual music writing is awful.
Yeah, well, what was interesting, I think, was that he sort of tricked everyone into thinking he was a music critic as opposed to someone who writes about music with high fidelity, because it was such a great book.
Absolutely.
And turned into such a compelling film that then all of a sudden he had, 31 songs, and he was doing guest pieces in The Guardian and The Times, yeah, and I found that, I find that a problem anyway. It's like when somebody, it's the kind of writerly equivalent of, I guess, an Australian Idol person getting a top billing on some charity gig rather than someone who's paid their dues on the toilet circuit. But
to some extent, but I think if you just look at the writing, the hard part is that you can be really nuanced and sensitive to the way in which humans relate to one another. But then if you combine that with sort of really, really generic received wisdom about music, then it's not really personal writing. So if you talk about how, awful your life is and how you hate your dead-end job, and then you say some really boring thing about, and Radiohead, blah, 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 which is the same thing that you've read in every other review. What was the point of the personal story? There's got to be something in the first part that really teases out some sort of insight into the music for there to be some value. What do you think, Mia?
Well, you got me thinking. I haven't read this Nick Hornby. I haven't read this Nick Hornby work at all because do you know why? It's because I've had too many douchebags tell me they like it, and as a result, it's become very difficult for me to put aside my social associations with his work. But anyway, it reminded me of the fact that I think the best music writing in the context of a novel was actually in American Psycho.
Yep.
And I found that the most arresting, awesome and passionate music. I mean, like, that, in a way, was like the most epic. And I hate to use that word because it's been totally raped by forums, but it was genuinely...
Damn you, 4chan.
It was genuinely like the most epic music criticism, and really just so rigorous and passionate.
Yep.
But that doesn't feed into the sense of autobiographical
to some extent,
writing.
I think it does.
I think it's something that kind of, it exists at two ends of the spectrum, and one end is, you see it a lot, I think, in street press. I'm sure we've all been guilty of it at some point, but you do see it. I know that James Clements copped some flack for a review of The Falls that ran in Beat a couple of years ago.
What did he say?
Oh, we talked about the music mostly, but there were a few mentions of some beautiful girl that he ran into.
Oh, please.
Do you remember? Yeah, okay, so that's one end of it.
God.
And then there's kind of nothing really that exists in the middle, because when you get to write for newspapers and magazines, a lot of the time you're writing as the royal we, or you're writing as Q Magazine. And then I think the other end of the spectrum is long-form music criticism.
Yep.
I mean, for me, the ultimate example of a good, using autobiographical information for good instead of evil, is Rob Sheffield's Love is a Mixtape, which is, well, essentially a memoir, really, of his relationship with this woman, Renee, the love of his life, and also talking about the mixtapes that they would make for each other. And, spoiler alert, the music that he was listening to after she died.
Oh, that sounds like a downer.
Real life spoiler alert. And it's just a beautiful book. I mean, Rob, he writes a lot for Rolling Stone and has done a lot of other stuff, and he's a terrific writer about music. That's where he came from, and it so happened that he also ended up being quite a lovely writer about, life as well.
Sorry, Mia, do you have a...
Oh, I just wanted to address the James Clements thing before we veered off too much. I have mentioned this before on this show. I am, frankly, very guilty of making reviews heavily autobiographical, but to draw from a recent example of something I wrote, which granted was actually a cosmetic review, but I was talking about an old woman on the tram who gave me a pen that she claimed was from Jesus. I'm not talking about men I want to lay, because I just think that's tacky and I don't think anyone wants to hear about it. And the fact that James Clemens, who honestly I've actually never met but talked to him on the phone once, I'm sure is a lovely guy. I don't want to know who he wants to inseminate with his seed and what this has to do with any concert ever. I'm just, you know...
I also think that the idea of sex in the context of a camping festival review I am inherently uncomfortable with.
Hygiene issues.
I start thinking of wet ones.